Welcome back to the Disconnected podcast. I'm your host, Jessica, and our guest today is Dr. Jessica Gaby. Dr. Gaby is an assistant professor of psychology at Middle Tennessee State University. She earned her PhD at Cornell University, and she specializes in human olfactory perception, social olfaction, and psychophysics. Dr. Gaby, can you tell us a little bit about your research?
Yeah, so I am broadly interested in the way that olfactory information impacts our daily lives. More specifically, I spend a lot of time looking at how the way that we smell informs other people about who we are as a person. So I'm very interested in the way that people make social judgments about the body odor of others.
What are some examples of the social cues that are contained in body odors, and how do they affect our perceptions of other people?
There's a lot of information that has been shown to be in body odor. A large amount of this research has been done on basically unadulterated armpit sweat. So when people donate body odor to a study, anything you've read about pheromones or mate choice or any of the stuff that you can think of in like popular culture about what smell means to us, typically the people that are participating in those experiments, the people who are giving their body odor to be smelled in the lab, they are asked to remove all outside odors. So you might spend anywhere from 2 days to 2 weeks having to not wear deodorant, having to wash with unscented soap, wash your clothes with unscented detergent, change your diet and remove things like curry and chili powder and other aromatic spices. And then after you spent that 48 hours to 2 weeks without all of those additional things, no perfumes, no lotions, anything like that, then you would wear a t-shirt for somewhere between like 12 and 24 hours probably, or they would tape cotton pads into your armpits and you would bring that t-shirt back to the lab. The researcher would cut out just the armpit, and then that's what somebody would smell when they come into the lab to participate in one of those studies. So the caveat of what we know about olfactory communication is that we do not know how much of that information makes it through into a real world context where you are wearing probably an antiperspirant if you're American, and even if you're not, probably some degree of deodorant, right? And then on top of that, probably fragrance. Even if you're not wearing perfume, probably your detergent has some smell, your shampoo and your conditioner, right? Your cosmetics, all of those things have odors. And then of course you have these potential dietary contributions. And so we actually don't know exactly how much of that information comes through in real life. But what the research shows is that we can pick up a lot of information from that armpit sweat. So we can do everything from detecting single allele differences in the human immune system to detecting things like gender and age. We seem to respond differently to people who are healthy and sick. We see that people can interpret emotions from sweat. So when somebody is in an anxious state, we interpret that sweat differently than when somebody is calm and happy. We are particularly good at identifying fear sweat, but we also seem to even react to something like the sweat of somebody collected from someone in a happy state. Humans as a species are not very good at verbally describing odors. We are actually really bad. If I give you an odor in an unlabeled jar and I say, "What is this?" the chances that you'll be able to pick out that is strawberry over raspberry are pretty low, right? That you would just organically be able to pull that out, because the parts of our brain that deal with language processing and the parts of our brain that deal with olfactory processing are not very well connected. So we just have like a physiological break between those two areas of the brain that makes it more difficult for us to talk about odor in a verbal way. However, we often use other processes to sort of look at people's perceptions of these cues. And so what we see is that people respond differently. Additionally, with emotional sweat, we see that people start to mimic the facial expressions of the emotional state of the people that were donating the body odor, which is really interesting. So not only are we able to respond differently, but we are actually seeing what we would call emotional contagion, where if I smell the sweat of somebody who is afraid, I start to actually mimic expressions of fear. And since, from what we know about things like embodied cognition, mimicking those in my facial expressions can actually trigger a fear response inside my body as well. We see that heart rate changes reflect the happiness or sadness or fear of an odor.
When we have a very strong emotional response, does someone respond just as strongly to that?
I mean, you would expect so, but again, it's very difficult to do this kind of a study in a realistic interaction. So typically what we're seeing, what you're looking at when you talk about a study like that, is they had some people come in and watch, say, a very scary movie or the funniest movie. Like they screened a bunch of movies and looked for like the absolute like globally funniest movie that there is, right? So, and then what they do is they're collecting armpit sweat. These people are not wearing deodorant, all the same stuff that I just talked about. And then what they're doing is they're probably pooling the odor from multiple individuals because some people will respond more strongly to these stimuli than others. And so when you want to categorically say, do we respond to the smell of fear? It's a lot easier to pool multiple donors and say, well, it's not just that like Kelly emits a good smell of fear. It's that like globally people have this fear response, right? Because it might be that I am very scared of scary movies, but you watch horror films all the time. So it's not that big of a deal, right? Like it's still kind of like shocking and anxiety inducing, but it's not like I am like terrified on the edge of my seat and you were like, this is unpleasant. So those two things are really different. And so in order to control for those individual differences, typically when people do studies on stuff like emotion, they're pooling sweat from multiple individuals. So it's a little bit hard to say. I think that we would expect that to be true. And if you think sort of evolutionarily about why we might need to be able to communicate these feelings, particularly with fear, you might think that, first of all, if there is a predator nearby, you would want to be able to communicate to others around you silently without moving, that there is something they should be aware of, right? And so we might produce this chemical that says, hey, something like you should be paying attention a little bit more than you were before, right? But you can also think that if we were able to maybe run away, we might want to leave a warning signal in our place. And then somebody might come by in a minute and say, oh, wait a minute, something's off here. I should look around and see if there's like a large bear, right? Right. I mean, that's obviously like an oversimplification, and then of course, you can think about it as far as like human bonding. If we're together and you're making me feel really happy, I want to have additional reinforcement of the kinds of nonverbal signals I'm giving you through my face and through my whatever. But having an olfactory signal also helps to sort of communicate like, yes, this is making me happy. This is a positive experience for me. And maybe it helps trigger more positive feelings in you. And so we kind of build each other up in that way.
So what sort of personal factors influence how someone reacts to another person's body odor? Is there a genetic component? Can a person changing some of those factors like perfume or cologne make them more likable in a sense?
My graduate work looked at whether or not people perceived body odor differently depending on if you do what we call a washout, which is when you remove all those outside odors and you stop wearing deodorant and all that, or if you appear in the way that you normally would go into the world. So I call the sort of olfactory environment that we create for ourselves when we go out into the world, I call this your diplomatic odor, right? So this is not just whether you're wearing perfume or not, it's all of the layers that I talked about earlier, your cosmetics, your hygiene habits, your shampoo, conditioner, deodorant, all of those things, your dietary habits, whether you have a cat or a dog at home, right? All of these things combine to make this sort of unified percept that is the way that I smell. And surely you can think that if you, in different times, right, if you had a party and someone left a sweater at your house, maybe you could pick it up and be like, oh, that's Kelly's. We are able to attribute these sort of global body odors to individuals. And so in my graduate work, I looked at whether or not the perception of strangers is different if they show up with their diplomatic scent or with their natural scent, having done a washout. And the answer is yes, it is very different. In some cases, it's better. In some cases, it's not. And again, that really relies on these individual differences of the perceiver, right? So not only do we have idiosyncratic preferences for different individuals, but those things are rooted in, number one, you're right, our genetics. Number two, in our experiences. And number three, in our expectations. So everybody's olfactory code is a little bit different. We have 350 different olfactory receptors, which is a lot different than the, say, 3 cones that we have in our eyes that perceive color. And so everybody has a very similar set, but they're not necessarily exactly the same. And so what we see is that across individuals, we see things that are called specific anosmias. The way that olfactory perception works is you have these 350 different olfactory receptors. They all respond to either a specific molecule or class of molecules. And some of them might respond to more than one, but different receptors might respond to the same molecule, but one would respond more strongly than the other. And so when you smell an odor, right, that's a combination of usually a bunch of different molecules. And so what your olfactory system does is it looks at not only which receptors are activated, but how strongly they're activated. And the pattern of activation across these 350 different receptors helps us decode the odor that we're smelling. So when we look at these differences between individuals in the receptors that they have, we see that people have differences not only in which receptors they have, but also in the number of receptors they have. So you can imagine that if I have a lot of receptor type A, then I might smell an odor very strongly, whereas if you have only a few, you would respond to it less well, right? And then, of course, there are people that don't have receptor A, and those people are anosmic for that particular odor, but not any other odor in the world. So you might have like a completely normal sense of smell, but discover that there is one smell that you cannot smell. And so far, we haven't noticed that any of them are linked, but it is possible. In particular, we see that people respond differentially to an odor called androstenone, which is contained in human sweat. And so you can either not be able to smell it at all. You can smell it as sort of a mild floral odor, or you can smell it as like disgusting and sweaty. And this is all, of course, rooted in your genetic code that determines which receptors you have. Now, androstenone is a funky one because you can actually learn to smell it over time, which is very strange. It happened to me. But most people, at a baseline, either can or can't smell it. And then if they can smell it, they smell it either as sort of a pleasant odor or sort of an unpleasant odor. And so you can imagine that because that's contained in human sweat, my response to somebody's body odor could be drastically different from another individual that has a different set of receptors. But then additionally, we see that people's experience and cultural background has a really big load on the way that they perceive particularly body odors. I mean, all odors really. Depending on where you grew up in the world, your expectations for like how a person should smell might be different, might be drastically different, right? So I grew up in Miami where there's a really heavily Cuban population, and there is a cultural expectation that Cuban men smell good. It's like a point of like masculine pride that they smell really nice. But that means that they typically wear like cologne. And that is not at all true in, say, Ithaca, where I went to graduate school. No one wears cologne there. And if a guy from Miami showed up in Ithaca wearing the amount of cologne that you would normally wear in Miami to like just a regular day, everybody would be like, what is happening? Like, what is this? What are you doing? Because that's like not the culture at all in Ithaca. And so, you can imagine that my having grown up in Miami gives me just a different expectation for what people might smell like in the world than somebody that grew up in Ithaca and has never encountered that, and then goes to Miami and is at a party and is like, I can't breathe. I have no idea what's happening here. There's like so much cologne everywhere, right? And I used to notice like when I would go home for, the holidays, I'd go to a party and I'd come home and I'd be like, oh, this smells like one friend. This smells like, like my one shoulder smells like my one friend. The other shoulder smells like the other friend. Like you carry these scents with you, right? It's not just that they're like happening in a vacuum, right? You are also involved in a way. And then the other thing is, there's sort of the environmental factor. So in Miami, everybody's wearing tank tops. It's hot. It's humid. You just waft odor off yourself in a way that you don't when it's like 10 degrees in Ithaca and you're wearing 2 sweaters. So even if they wore the same amount of cologne, just the experience of encountering an individual in those 2 environmental contexts would be different. So there's a bunch of different factors that go into the way that we perceive body odor, but additionally also, food odors and environmental odors, stuff like that.
Yeah, definitely. So beyond the food and perfume and cologne and things like that, do individuals have their own particular body odor that they're born with?
Yeah, so it is changeable. Human sweat is actually odorless. It is the byproducts of the bacteria that live on our skin that create what we think of as body odor. There's multiple factors at play here, right? So one factor is your genetic makeup contributes to the kinds of byproducts that are in your sweat and what concentration they're in. 2, the bacteria that live on your skin contributes to the way that those byproducts are processed and the odors that are resultant from those bacteria. And then 3, both of those things can shift depending on your hormonal status. And then, of course, where you live might influence the bacteria that live on your skin. Your diet can really, in theory, have an influence in the way that you smell, not only because of what you're eating, but also like just sort of physiological factors. So we see that inflammation seems to play a role in the way that people smell. Definitely, there are lots of diseases that are actually diagnosed first by odor. If you've ever met a diabetic who's not very well regulated, they exude ketones, which have sort of this like sweet smell. But there's lots of other diseases that can be categorized by odor as well. And of course, we know that things like, dogs can smell cancer, right? That's not like an imaginary thing. That's actually a cue that we're emitting that a dog can pick up on. We don't seem to be able to smell it as humans, but that doesn't mean that there isn't olfactory information being passed. Yes. So the way that you smell has a lot of different like moving parts, right? But everybody does have an odor fingerprint. And so if you take people's sweat, when you've eliminated all of these outside factors, right? Everybody's on the same diet, they're all wearing unscented whatever, they're not wearing deodorant, all of that stuff. You still do see that there are categorical differences between individuals such that you could map an individual person's sort of like odor fingerprint. And that's the basis for some of these ideas of, first of all, for like individual-centered healthcare, where you might be able to monitor, say, this is what your body odor smells like as a baseline. And then, this is something that would be done through like electronic processes, right? Not like the doctor smelling you. Although in traditional medicine, that is actually one of the first things that they do is they smell you.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. And it can be used, of course, it can be used diagnostically, right? There's sort of people that are working towards this idea that like maybe we could have electronic noses that are able to monitor sort of like, this is your baseline. And if you all of a sudden start having a kick up in one of these compounds, perhaps it suggests that you are ill in a particular way. I mean, this is all theoretical. We could monitor for things like cancer. We could monitor for things like diabetes based on olfactory information. It's also the basis for ideas about like security and maybe using odor to like hunt down criminals and stuff like that.
Wow, very interesting.
Yeah.
On that same train of thought, in your article, Smelling is Telling, published in Chemical Senses, you wrote neural processing of familiar body odors differs from that of strangers. How so?
Yeah, so that is not my work. That is the work that comes out of Ewan Lundstrom's lab. And he looked at neural activation, so the parts of your brain that are active when you're smelling the odors of strangers versus people that you are familiar with. And what we see is that there's increased activation in areas of the brain that deal with sort of attention and deal with emotional processing, in particular fear. And so, again, most people are not consciously responding to these odors, right? The truth is that the sense of smell is wired to sort of run subconsciously. Most of the time, you are not attending to your sense of smell. And again, because we have these difficulties with verbally describing odors, most of the time we're really not paying attention to olfactory information, even though it is influencing our behavior. The way that olfactory information is processed, you can actually start responding physically to an odor before you're even consciously aware of what it is, right? So you might catch a whiff of smoke and turn your head towards it before you're like, oh, that is smoke, right? You might already be looking for the source of that information before you're really able to sort of consciously decode what it is that's going on, right? And so when we talk about the way that people process social olfactory information, by and large, this isn't the thing that's like at the forefront of our brain, unless it in some way really drastically violates our expectations, right? If I expect somebody to smell like nothing and they show up wearing a pound of cologne, then yeah, I'm going to be like, whoa, that is not what I was thinking you were going to smell like. And that is going to be the thing that I attend to the most. But as long as they're sort of like within the sort of the bounds of what I am thinking a person is going to smell like, I'm probably not going to spend a lot of energy decoding exactly what their body odor is, unless I find it particularly attractive, unless I find it particularly revolting, say like really bad breath or whatever, right? Like there are reasons why we might pay attention, but most of the time we aren't. And so olfactory information seems to work as a backup to other sensory perceptions that, other sensory judgments that we make about individuals. But we do see this increased activation in the amygdala and other the insula, so emotional processing areas and attention areas. That suggests that we are paying more attention and that we are more cautious in decoding the odors of individuals that we don't know.
It's very interesting. I was actually reminded of a song by 21 Pilots. I don't know if you know the band, but they have a song that's pretty popular. It's called Stressed Out. And in the song, the singer talks about how he and his brother have almost the same sense of smell. He talks about smelling something and it reminds him of his childhood and how that like he wishes he could put it into a candle and then he would give it to his brother because they have the same childhood. So he would know, but then he can't ever figure out where the smell is coming from. You're talking about how we process the smells around us as emotional stimuli, particularly body odors, which creates a strong connection between odor and memory, right? Mm-hmm. So what happens when we can't physically be around each other?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And I think that it's actually especially pertinent in the time of COVID, right? Because we've all been wearing these masks and we've all been social distancing. And so even though, again, I said that we're not necessarily attending strongly to olfactory information, we are still perceiving it. We are still making decisions based on it, right? Certainly, yes, when you are not able to be around another individual, you're losing an important layer of information. Much of the research here has focused on sexual attraction. But olfactory information is really important in things like mother-infant bonding, right? Familial bonding. It seems to be important in bonding between, other relatives, between friends, potentially. It's another thing that I'm looking at in my research is how it affects perception of individuals that you might potentially consider as friends. Yeah, when we don't have that information, we are losing an important layer. And I have thought about this myself. I recently started collaborating with a colleague who I only had ever interacted with from far away, both wearing masks. And I thought, what if this person smells bad? Like, what if later I discover that I can't be in the same room with them? How is this going to impact our future work, right? And so it's not just in the context of dating, although of course it's really important in the context of dating. And when you think about the way that people have potentially formed, if they were being appropriately cautious, the way that people were doing like these online video dates and then not meeting somebody until 5 or 6 virtual dates in. I don't know. I didn't do that, but I'm curious to know if people experienced that, if people were like, oh, but you smell really bad to me. And I didn't know that. And for some people, again, because everybody has sort of a different weight on these types of signals, women probably more strongly than men. But some people might be okay with it. They might be like, I really like you. I think you're really cute. Your personality really works for me. I don't care that I don't really like the way that you smell, or maybe like you wear a cologne that I like and we'll just call it good. But I'm a person who pays a lot of attention to the way that people smell. And so I can imagine that if I had experienced that, if I had done that, I could, meet a guy in real life and be like, oh, this is not going to work. Sorry.
Your opinion, how important do you think it is in forming relationships, your sense of smell and how you process that information?
So we can say a little bit about the importance of olfaction in relationships. Again, going back to sort of dating satisfaction, we do see that people who are anosmic, so who have lost their sense of smell, report a lot less satisfaction with their partners. And that's work that comes out of Thomas Hummel's lab. And there really do seem to be quality of life differences, not just in the experience of eating and drinking and stuff like that, which I will tell you that almost everything we perceive as the flavor of something is actually olfactory perception. Our tongue only interprets sour, bitter, salty, sweet, and umami. Everything else, every quality of flavor is actually an olfactory percept. It's just that our brain kind of unifies them and makes it seem as though it's coming from your mouth, but it's actually on your nose. But when people lose their sense of smell, they lose the ability to perceive flavor. They lose the ability to do things like know whether the milk is rancid, right? Or if something's on fire. But then also we do see that they really report a loss of interpersonal closeness. So we know that it is important. I personally think that for me, it's very important. And again, we know that it's important in things like bonding between mothers and their children and stuff like that. But it's going to differ a little bit for everybody. I happen to have a pretty good sense of smell. Some people might have a less good sense of smell. It might matter less to them. Or maybe you have a not as good sense of smell, but it's really important to you. So yes, we do know that globally it's important. Individual differences suggest that some people have more focus on that than others.
I wanted to follow up about the bonds that you've already created and how you react to people you know and their smell versus people you don't. Are there certain reactions in the brain that we can see that when we're reacting to someone we know versus not?
Yeah, so we do see some interesting stuff. Number one, anecdotally, you can think of lots of situations where somebody might say, sleep with the t-shirt of their partner who's absent, or my son was born really early. And he was in the NICU for a long time. And one of the things that they suggested to me was that, I would have done it anyway, but they were like, bring in your t-shirt, right? So that he can get used to your smell, because that can help him in the NICU. It actually has been shown to help with neurological development of these premature babies. We see that people are able to withstand painful stimuli longer if they're smelling the body odor of a partner with whom they're in a positive relationship. And then again, we can see that odors can trigger things like PTSD and negative reactions to, not only environmental odors. We do see a lot of triggering of PTSD symptoms with environmental odors, but if you are in an abusive relationship and you finally escape and you smell the cologne of that boyfriend, certainly you can imagine that you might have emotional fallout from that experience. So yeah, we know, you mentioned earlier, smell is really tightly linked with memory and emotional processing. And so yes, we do see that when people are smelling odors with which they have a positive emotional association, whether they be body odors or environmental odors, but particularly in the context of body odors, that we do have these positive emotional reactions. And we can see that both in neural processing and in physiological response. So slowing of heart rate, decrease of other anxiety symptoms, holding your hand in a bucket of ice water longer than if you weren't smelling that odor. And then of course we can see it in these sort of self-soothing actions, things like smelling your partner's shirt when he's out of town.
Yeah, definitely. Is there anything else that you'd like to add on the topic?
Mostly just a quick plug that I'm doing a study in the fall where I'm looking at the impact of diet on body odor. And for like MTSU affiliated people, I will be looking for participants. So.
Okay, cool. Nice. I will definitely include that. Well, I guess I wanted to say thank you. Thank you